Have you ever struggled with unforgiveness? If we're honest, I believe we all have. But that's not how God wants us to live. Even though He commands us to forgive, it's not just to let the other person off the hook. He wants us to forgive because He knows how holding on to resentment can cause a cancer to grow in our hearts, hurting us so much more than the person who caused the hurt. In this episode, I'll be sharing several instances where God convicted me of my unforgiving heart, as well as a parable where Jesus shows us how ungrateful we are when we don't forgive. Welcome to the Kitchen Table series of the Building Strong Homes podcast, where faith meets family in practical, powerful ways. Hi, I'm Carol Roper, wife, mom, and former home designer turned encourager for women who want homes rooted in God's Word. Think of these episodes as a cozy chat over coffee, helping you build a home that stands strong, not just structurally, but spiritually. So pull up a chair, friend. Let's talk faith, family, and the kind of legacy that lasts. In my last kitchen table episode, number 147, I mentioned that through counseling, I discovered my depression stemmed from a bitter root of unforgiveness that I wasn't even aware was causing me so much harm. As I mentioned in the opening, I feel like unforgiveness is something we all struggle with at least a few times in our lives. Some hold on to it like a trophy, holding it over the offender's head or using it as a topic of gossip and conversation. I know because I've been there. And to be honest, I still sometimes struggle. Thankfully, not like I used to, but I still find myself holding on to an offense now and then. 1 Corinthians 13:5 in the NIV translation says that love does not dishonor others, is not self-seeking, is not easily angered, and it keeps no record of wrongs. Now, those last couple of phrases are the hardest ones I think a lot of us struggle with. Not get angry and keep no record of wrongs. But I've learned over the years that keeping a record of offenses and staying angry only causes us to rot inside of our souls. When my sister-in-law Sandra and I owned a florist in the 90s and were struggling even to get a paycheck from week to week, it became easy to record the offenses of those who didn't pay their bills or took advantage of our kindness. Sandra paid the bills in the business, and I was the one who invoiced the customers. Back in the day in small towns, it was typical for businesses to extend credit to their customers and bill them once a month. Now that seems crazy, but if we didn't give them that option, a lot of customers would go elsewhere for their flowers. So when I'd write up the invoices each month and see how many people weren't paying their bill, I would get a little ticked off, especially when it went on for months and I realized they had no intention of paying. There was one particular Valentine's Day where a lady called and wanted to send $75 worth of balloons, candy, and flowers to her husband. Since I didn't really know her, I hesitated to give her credit. We didn't even ask for credit card backup then because a lot of people either didn't have credit cards or would be offended if we suggested we'd need it if they ended up not paying their bill. She assured me she was a Christian and always paid her bills. Spoiler alert, I've since learned that if someone tells you they are Christian and are asking for credit, 100% of the time that bill will never get paid. Because we needed the business, however, I took a chance and extended the credit. For the first couple of months, I sent her an invoice with no response. After the third month, I called. Unfortunately for her, there was no caller ID back then, and she answered the phone. When I requested she pay her bill immediately, she said they couldn't afford to pay because her son was sick, and the medicine was expensive. I calmly told her I understood and asked if she'd be willing to pay at least $10 a week until the balance was cleared. At this point, I was just wanting her to pay any amount as a show of good faith. She got angry with me, said I didn't understand and that she'd send me the money when she had it. Then she hung up. That conversation played over and over in my mind in the days and weeks ahead. Since I knew where she lived and I drove by her house every day, my blood pressure always went up a few points when I saw it. I kept sending bills and calling, always with the excuse they didn't have the money. One day I was in the grocery store and saw her husband buying a 24-can case of beer. I immediately began seething with anger. They could spend money on beer but not pay their bill, even $10. Every day brought more resentment towards this lady who'd begged me to give her credit. And every time I'd drive by her house, my temper flared. That was usually at least twice a day. My anger towards her was growing a bitter root inside, and I didn't like what it was doing to me. Eventually, I realized I was wasting my time and stamps trying to get our money from her and asked God to help me let it go. But every time I drive by our house, it would rear its ugly head again. One day, I remembered a familiar Bible passage as I passed by, where Peter asked Jesus how many times he should forgive someone who sins against him. Let me read it to you. Matthew 18:21 through 22 in the NIV says, Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Some translations say 70 times 7, which is 490. Peter thought he was being generous by saying 7 times, but Jesus answered by saying, in essence, you shall continue forgiving them. And I had a new understanding of that passage. I used to think what Jesus said meant that we should forgive someone each time they offend us or do us wrong. But as I drove by that lady's house several times a day, I knew it meant that I needed to forgive her for the same offense every time I drove by. Every single time. When I realized I wasn't going to be able to forgive her quickly, I asked God to help me forgive her every time I saw her house. At first, I would either pray it out loud or in my head. Jesus, help me to forgive her. As the days wore on and it became easier, and I became freer in my spirit because my anger wasn't weighing me down all the time. Then one day, after I'd passed her house, I realized I hadn't even thought about it. That happened more frequently as time passed. That was over 30 years ago, and I rarely ever think about her or the debt when I pass by that house. So you might say, well, Carol, that was only $75 30 years ago. You don't know what this person has done to me. And I agree, I don't know. But I do know from personal experience that unforgiveness will eat you alive and make you a bitter person to the point where people won't want to be around you. I had a larger debt that went unpaid a few years ago and was glad God had taught me how to let go of bitterness when I was younger. I used to frequently draw house plans for a client who was an architect and a builder. He only wanted to design the houses, so he had me do the detailed drawings for him. We had a pretty good working relationship, and I enjoyed learning new things about design from his experiences of studying architecture in Europe. Since the houses were large and I charged by the square foot, I made pretty good money working for him. Until one day, while in the middle of drawing one of his houses, I couldn't get in touch with him. He owed me $1,700, and I wasn't able to find him. I kept calling and even sent invoices to his business with no response. I finally found out he'd been arrested for insurance fraud. I never have heard from him again. Needless to say, I never got my $1,700 and found myself angry over the unpaid debt. I even contacted a lawyer to see if there was any way to get my money. But he said I'd pay more in lawyer fees and still may not be able to get paid. Essentially, he told me to forget about it. I thought about the lady who owed me $75 all those years ago and how I finally understood that for my own sake, I had to forgive her. So I wrote this man a letter and said I appreciated working with him and all he taught me about design. In closing, I said I was forgiving him for the debt he owed. I may have said if he ever found it in his heart or a bank account to pay me, I would appreciate it, but it wasn't necessary. I mailed that letter and once again let it go. Whenever I find myself remembering the debt, I ask God to continue helping me to forgive this man. Even though it was much more money this time, it was easier. The bitterness gained from unforgiveness wasn't worth it. Before I end this episode, I want to share the rest of that passage where Jesus says we are to forgive 70 times 7. In Matthew 18:23 through 35 in the NIV, Jesus said, "Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold, I've read this was equivalent to $6 billion, was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. 'Be patient with me,' he begged, 'and I will pay back everything.' The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins, which was equivalent to 100 days' wages for a day laborer. He grabbed him and began to choke him. 'Pay back what you owe me,' he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay it back.' But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. 'You wicked servant,' he said, 'I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?' In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." Wow. The first servant seems so wicked to us that he would take someone with a much lesser debt than him and put him in prison. Again, the first servant owed the king $6 billion. The king knew there was no way the servant could ever hope to pay that back. Both servants responded the same way, falling to their knees and begging forgiveness for their debt. But the gracious king took pity on him and forgave him of all of his debt. Even though the king knew he could never repay the debt, he forgave it anyway. But the servant didn't see it the same way. He was probably frustrated that he was put in that position in the first place, so he took it out on another guy who owed him a mere pittance compared to his debt. Even though the second servant begged for patience, the first servant decided not to pass on the same grace that he was given. But when the king heard of his unforgiveness, he gave him over to not only be imprisoned, but tortured as well, until he paid back all he owed. Well, that would be impossible. So he was given a life sentence of suffering because he wouldn't forgive. We can look at this passage two ways. The first thing that comes to mind for me is the gift Jesus gave us on the cross by making a way to salvation through his death and resurrection. Nothing or no amount of money could equal this amazing gift Christ has given to us through his mercy and grace. And those who don't accept it are destined to suffer in hell for eternity. The second is the way I lived before I learned the importance of forgiveness. I was miserable in my spirit and had a temper with a quick fuse. I would ruminate over offenses continually. That wasn't good for me or my relationship with Jesus, and it certainly wasn't good for my husband and kids. But once I went through that dark season of depression, I understood on a much deeper level how Satan wants us to hold on to bitterness and grudges. They give him a foothold into our hearts and minds. And then we can't fulfill the purposes God has for us and find the blessing from serving him. We can't attain the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control with a bitter heart. So let me ask you, is there someone you need to forgive today? Maybe there's been a squabble in your family and now you have to celebrate the holidays in separate spaces because you can't let go of the hurt. Maybe everyone else is suffering because you're unwilling to go to that other person and say you forgive them. Or maybe different people in your family have different views on politics and have decided it's best not to get together anymore. Would you be willing to lay that down and not talk about it or even think about it while you're together? Or maybe a parent has hurt you and you don't want to be in the same room as them, much less celebrate the holidays together. In addition to forgiveness, ask God what He would have you to do. I have to say right here that if you're in a dangerous or abusive situation, this doesn't mean you have to stay or even have contact with that person. Ask for help and get to safety. This is not what I'm talking about. But even if that is your situation, eventually, probably with the help of counseling, you will come to a time when you'll need to forgive. Let it go and live the abundant life of freedom Christ intended all along. Allow God to pull out the bitterness all the way to the bottom of that root. I promise you'll never regret it. I haven't, and I've never been the same. Friend, forgiveness isn't easy, but it is freeing. Holding on to resentment feels like control, but it's actually a prison for you. When we choose to release bitterness, we make room for God's peace to take root in our hearts. Here's today's blueprint tip. If you're struggling today, start small. Ask God to help you forgive every time the hurt resurfaces. Over time, He will pull out that bitter root and replace it with His love. You'll never regret choosing freedom over resentment. If this episode encouraged you, share it with someone who might need hope today. In 2 weeks on the kitchen table, we'll be celebrating the 5-year anniversary of the podcast with my guest host, Rebecca Edwards and Carly McNamara. We'll be sharing some of our and my listeners' favorite Christmas traditions. Since Carly and Rebecca are both young moms, they'll bring some different perspectives. And you'll get to see Carly's sweet baby Coleman if you watch it on YouTube. And also, we decorated and dressed for Christmas. This is a fun episode with creative and meaningful ideas you don't want to miss. So join us in 2 weeks for the fun, episode 151. Thank you, listener, for helping us get to 5 years. To God be the glory. Until next time, remember, your home becomes stronger when grace flows freely. Don't give up, especially when it's hard to forgive. Don't give in and keep building strong because you're building something that matters. Thanks so much for listening.